Julius Caesar. Military genius, empire builder, conquering hero. He's antiquity's Mr. Big, the guy with his head on the coin. But the coin has two sides. There's also Julius Caesar, sexy beast and ruthless killer. When he isn't in bed with other people's wives, he's always up for some genocide.
In the league table of history's mass murderers, Caesar is up there with Hitler and Stalin.
So what's behind the bad behavior?
I think we can ask, is he sick or just obsessively driven?
Investigators will explore ancient writings, including Caesar's own memoirs, to uncover the truth. They'll put events in his life to the test and reveal new medical evidence about the illness that caused his rapid deterioration. A forensic psychiatrist will dissect Caesar's personality to flush out the demons and see how he stacks up against other ancients behaving badly. Julius Caesar has an empire and an ego to match. He declares himself dictator of Rome for life, and his allies become his enemies. It doesn't help that he's been sleeping with their wives, prancing around in a laurel wreath and purple toga, even changing the calendar to have a new month, July, named after himself. Everybody's had enough. They crowd around him in the Senate chamber, and the daggers come out. Even his pal Brutus is in on it, muttering, it is said, these words as his long knife plunges home. Sic semper tyrannus. This is what happens to tyrants. To understand Caesar better, psychiatrist David Malott will examine his behavior and position him on a unique behaving badly psychograph, revealing how he compares to tyrants like Genghis Khan and Caligula.
I'm going to look at the life of Julius Caesar to see if he's a charismatic leader, to see if he's insane, or to see if he's a psychopath.
At first glance, it's not looking good for Caesar. He watches 20,000 helpless women and children starve to death.
These aren't warriors. These are women and children. But Caesar shows no mercy, no compassion.
He lets his soldiers slaughter 40,000 Gauls after beating them in battle.
In his war of conquest, he killed or enslaved a third of the population. That's an act of genocide.
He orders the hands of 2,000 Gauls chopped off and has a band of pirates crucified.
Caesar is sending out a signal. He's letting people know he is somebody to be reckoned with. Do not cross him.
Nobody says no to Caesar, least of all in bed. When it comes to sex, he's predatory and insatiable. How do we know all this? Caesar tells us himself in his memoirs. Others pick up the story. They include Roman historians Suetonius and Plutarch, who lived 100 years or so after Caesar's death. They depict a man who is ruthless and supremely ambitious. To get a sense of what formed Caesar's character, we must go back to his childhood. He grows up in Rome, the heart of the Roman Empire. Not in the aristocratic grandeur of the Palatine Hill, but here in the seedy, brothel-lined alleyways of Suburra.
Caesar's family were aristocrats, but it's been generations. They haven't tasted wealth or power. Now, the high and mighty of Rome and the senators are over on the Palatine Hill. That's like Park Avenue. This is like the Bronx.
Growing up on these mean streets is a fall from grace that has an impact on the young Caesar.
Julius Caesar is well aware of the glorious past of his family, and he feels very deeply the disconnect of his present circumstances to that past. He could have become very bitter, very angry, but instead he decides to climb that social and political ladder to where he should, in his mind, be.
With a goal like that, you can never climb high enough.
How is he going to climb his way, literally, back up the hill? The Roman army is the perfect place to start.
He's had a fascination with the army since childhood. One of his heroes is the consul Sulla, who uses his military might to seize control of Rome during a civil war. Power at the point of a spear. He joins the army at the age of 20 and distinguishes himself for battlefield bravery in Greece. But that's not what everybody's talking about.
There is a story that appears in some of the sources that Caesar had a sexual relationship with the king of Bithynia, which is in northern Turkey.
It's supposed to be a business trip. Caesar's in Turkey to negotiate with King Nicomedes for warships to aid the Roman cause. The talks drag on, and some say turn from ships to other matters, and possibly take place in the royal bedchamber. Smirking gossips call Caesar the Queen of Bithynia.
Within the Roman world, relations between men are much more accepted than they were in later societies. What the damaging thing to say is that he was passive in a sexual relationship with the king, a role that is, in their view, too much like being a woman.
The story haunts Caesar. His response is pure alpha male. He'll prove his manhood by seducing every woman in sight. Single, married, it doesn't matter. As to whether he ever had an encounter with King Nicomedes, there's no proof either way. And the crafty Caesar uses the gossip to his advantage.
This is a person of power. The king of Bithynia is a king. And that automatically lifts up the reputation and the prestige of Julius Caesar. He's above his fellow senators. He's now with royalty. And you can take the rest of the story for what you will.
Caesar's vigorous and frequent sexual exploits with both women and men inspire the poets. But it's not all romance. The scribe Catullus, writing during Caesar's lifetime, takes a more clinical approach, suggesting in verse that Caesar has come down with a dose of something bad. Is Catullus saying Caesar was so promiscuous that he contracted a sexually transmitted disease? Or is this just artistic license?
The four common venereal diseases, think about, there's chlamydia, there's syphilis, there's herpes, and of course there's gonorrhea. And it's pretty clear from the evidence that syphilis was not around in Roman times. Syphilis came to Europe from North America with the conquistadors.
So, rule out syphilis. What about herpes and gonorrhea? They'd have left physical marks on Caesar. Someone would have mentioned it. They can also be eliminated. That leaves one possibility.
Chlamydia, though, for women is bad, but for men it doesn't have, unless you're one of the unfortunate people that had developed prostatitis, which again, there's no certainly record of Caesar having such a problem. It's not going to affect his ability to rule the Republic/Empire one bit.
It's a problem for the women Caesar has sex with, but for him, no big deal. This promiscuous young man leads a charmed life. Caesar moves from the army into politics and the law. He's a powerful and persuasive speaker. His court cases draw great crowds. Romans buzz about the brilliant young man in their midst. Caesar, still in his 20s, is well on his way to greatness. On a trip to Greece, he shows how calculating and fearless he can be when he's captured by pirates.
At the time, Pirates have become a major, major problem for the Romans. They have infested the Mediterranean. And Caesar is yet another person to be captured by pirates. They realize, looking at him, this is a person of high status. This is a person that's going to fetch a lot of money. They demand a big ransom, 20 silver talents.
In today's money, that's around $130,000, a lifetime's wages for one of Caesar's soldiers.
Caesar laughs at them. He says he's worth way more than that, 50 talents at least.
It's a daring gambit that increases Caesar's chances of staying alive and gives him a measure of control over his situation.
Caesar demonstrates that he's cool in the face of great danger. In fact, he comes up with a brash and clever plan to secure his release. It's almost like he's James Bond, laughing in the face of his archenemy.
Caesar also goes on the offensive, turning into the guest from hell. He orders the pirates around, demands they be quiet when he wants to sleep, recites his own poetry, and berates them for not appreciating it. The pirates have had enough. They want their money. If they don't get it, they'll kill Caesar. But Caesar raises the stakes and issues a dire threat of his own. If they release him, he promises to return and kill them. One way or another, somebody dies. Julius Caesar, still in his 20s, is already a carpe diem, seize the day kind of guy. When Greek pirates hold him for ransom, he makes a promise. He'll get out of this, then come back and crucify them all. The pirates just laugh. When the ransom is eventually paid, Caesar is released. He then raises a small naval force and makes good his threat. He crucifies the pirates. A most painful and lingering death. But first, he orders their throats cut.
All of Rome was talking about it. It was like a major news item. He was simultaneously decisive, brutal, and in control, but with a touch of humanity. He slit the throat of his captors to put them out of their misery. Did it happen like this? Is he just making it up? It's great PR. But what we know about Caesar in his later life is he's in control. It has the ring of truth to it.
Julius Caesar, dashing young pirate slayer. Women swoon, and he moves in for a different kind of kill. He is said to have slept with almost all of the wives of Rome's aristocrats. He works his way through 4 wives of his own. So what's he really up to?
Lots of politicians and powerful men sleep with women. They enjoy the thrill of the secret sex. However, Caesar, in addition, uses his sexual behavior to dominate women and, by extension, to show his dominance over their husbands.
He's sculpted, he's chisel-jawed, he's Mr. Irresistible. That, at least, is how artists and sculptors have depicted Caesar over the centuries. No wonder the girls fall for him. But Caesar takes care of his appearance, getting his toga to fit just so, combing his hair to cover his bald patch. So is Caesar really the matinee idol?
When we think about what Julius Caesar looked like, we have some portraits that we can examine, and we have likenesses of him on his coins. But for a person as famous as Julius Caesar, we just don't have that much evidence.
A remarkable discovery pulled from a French river in 2008 can help. A marble Caesar head over 2,000 years old. It's believed to be one of only a handful ever found that were carved during his lifetime. Is it a true likeness? Forensic artist Victoria Lywood believes it's the face of a real person.
The facial lines of a 50-year-old man were in his forehead, crossing his nose, his vertical glabellar lines through the top of his head. This looked to me like this was an artist had possibly done the sculpture during the time of Caesar's life.
Using face mapping technology, Lywood sets out to reproduce the real face of Caesar, starting with his missing nose.
We're very lucky in this reconstruction in that he has two pieces that I don't usually have to work with in skeletal remains, and that is the bridge of the nose and the columella, the little piece under your nose that holds up the tip. Now, it's the soft tissue and tip that's missing here. 60% of the vertical length of your nose is how far your nose will project if you have a nose that's aesthetically correct. So we now have a general shape of Caesar's nose and how far it should project from his face.
Now Lywood adds elements to the face to generate a photorealistic image. Then the years are rolled back. And this comes to computerized life. The face of the ambitious young Caesar. The face that wooed the women. Over the next few years, Caesar aims high, nothing less than the top job. Consul, the head of government for Republican Rome. But just as today's political parties rack up debt on the campaign trail, so did Caesar. This debt could kill his career stone dead. So he's on the lookout for allies and money, and suggests an alliance with the wealthy Crassus and the military hero Pompey. They agree. It doesn't seem to matter that he's had affairs with both their wives. You don't say no to a man on the make.
Forget the fancy titles, consul, high priest and so on. What this is about is a city being divided up between the equivalent of three powerful mafia bosses. It's about patronage and power. It's about deciding who gets the fat contracts, like in a modern city, who clears the garbage, who controls the teamsters. Ancient Rome is just the same. These are the three most powerful players in the Roman Empire, and they're deciding how they're going to divide up the spoils.
Caesar's share of the spoils includes Roman Gaul, made up of what is now northern Italy and parts of modern-day France. He becomes governor, and that gives him absolute power. But he's a governor with a problem. He's still in debt. He decides to go to war. In Roman times, it's good business. There's money to be made in pillaged treasure and slaves. His target? The unconquered parts of Gaul.
We need to completely revise the way we think about warfare. Nowadays, we worry about how many tax dollars it's going to cost. In Caesar's day, what he's thinking about is how much profit can be made out of conquest, because Rome was essentially a system of robbery with violence.
We know what happens next thanks to vividly described frontline dispatches from Caesar himself. I came, I saw, I conquered, he boasts. It's all image-building fodder for the folks back home.
Caesar knew exactly how his victories would play in Rome. That was one of the reasons he was fighting in the first place. And if you think about what happens in the Second World War, generals like MacArthur, Patton, the British Field Marshal Montgomery, they cultivated relationships with their own favourite reporters because they wanted to get the best publicity they could. Well, in Caesar's case, it's the same, and he's his own reporter.
This obsessive attention to detail reveals a crucial element of Caesar's personality.
Psychologically, he needs to be in control of his image. He's not going to leave it to other people. He is going to be the one to decide who Julius Caesar is.
Caesar takes his big ego to the battlefield, and the Gauls quake. 60 miles west of Dijon lies Bibracte, one of the most important hill forts in Gaul. Scene of a bloody battle with the Gallic Helvetii tribe.
Where I'm standing, I'm 2,500 feet up. It's the highest place for 150 miles, and it completely dominates this landscape. So it was absolutely crucial for the Gauls to hold it, but it was equally crucial for Caesar to try and take it. So there was a major clash here, a huge battle between the two sides.
Evidence has been found that shows just how ruthless the fighting was here. Skulls pitted with sword marks. Caesar, writing about the battle that took place here, states that the Helvetii were the bravest of all Gallic tribes. And archaeologists have uncovered evidence that reveals how Caesar deploys the most terrifying weapons in the vast Roman armory, aiming to inflict maximum death and destruction.
This is an extraordinary discovery. It's one of Julius Caesar's high-tech weapons, an incendiary bomb, effectively, from 2,000 years ago. This is the head of an arrow that would have been shot out of a Roman catapult. I've never seen anything quite like it. The point at this end, this wire cage here, designed, one assumes, to contain some sticky substance that would have been on fire as it flew through the air. And it would have been designed to set a Gallic settlement on fire. This is an example of the kind of high-tech warfare the Gauls were up against fighting Julius Caesar.
Caesar also arms his legions with the pilum, a javelin-like weapon. Caesar's gloating frontline dispatches record their terrible effect, the spears tearing through shields and skewering the Gallic warriors. It could be Caesar's self-promoting hype, or it could be deadly accurate.
A pilum is a uniquely Roman weapon, right? It's specifically designed for the army, and it's specifically designed to kill your opponent. It's designed to throw at very short distances towards a mass rank of enemies.
John Cerati is going to test Caesar's claims to see how effective it is against the Gallic shield.
So this is our mock-up of a Gallic shield. It's not an exact replica of a shield. We've eliminated the boss, not necessarily the exact shape of a shield, but we know they used heavy wood. So we have 3 planks. This is ½ an inch oak wood here and covered with tan treated leather. What we're going to do is have our pilum thrower launch the weapon at the shield just to test its penetrative power.
And in the role of Roman legionary for the day is Mike Harbour, international javelin competitor.
Well, we've got a penetration. It went through a good 6 inches, and the weight which is now on the shield is tremendous. So even if it's not going through to kill the enemy, it's rendered his shield useless. So he would have had to drop his shield and expose his entire left side to the Roman swordsman in front of him.
The verdict: against a weapon like this, the Gauls never stood a chance.
Well, Julius Caesar was a master of self-promotion and propaganda. A lot of what he said would have been exaggerated. Here, he was not lying. There's no doubt that the poor Gaul who was behind this shield would be long since dead. So, Caesar was right.
The pilum shatters Gallic front lines. But the Gauls have hundreds of thousands more soldiers than Caesar. If Caesar is to win, he'll have to kill on a monumental scale. Julius Caesar is on a mission to make himself a hero in Rome by conquering Gaul. One by one, he sacks and pillages Gallic towns and villages, each victory adding to his wealth. Now he approaches Avaricum, 150 miles south of modern-day Paris, where the Gallic defenders wait behind fortified walls. Caesar lays siege to the town for 25 days. When he finally storms the walls, he overruns the weakened defenders. Now the serious killing begins. Caesar's legions slaughter 39,000 men, women, and children. 800 are left alive to carry a stark message to other Gauls. Resistance is futile. With the laying waste and pillage part out of the way, it's time for some R&R, Roman style. Caesar has a standing order. After a victory, the soldiers are to be turned loose to do as they please. He brags that his men fight just as well when they're stinking of perfume.
Having sex with captives, with women, prostitutes who follow the Roman army, this is just par for the course. Everyone, every Roman does this.
But there's worse to come. Caesar finally reveals the true extent of his cruelty at the climax of war in Gaul, on a battleground 125 miles east of Avaricum. This huge mound was Alesia, a hill fort. Here Caesar faces an army of 80,000, led by Gaul's most successful commander, Vercingetorix.
Vercingetorix retreated with his 80,000 men onto an immensely strong natural fortification. A little bit like this rock, if you can imagine it, a mile across, but with sheer cliff faces like this, making it the kind of fortification which really Caesar couldn't contemplate taking by storm. So what does he do? He builds a great wall around the outside, 10 miles long, heavily fortified, to keep these 80,000 Gauls penned up inside until they're starved into submission.
It's a killer siege. Vercingetorix had inflicted heavy casualties on Caesar's army earlier that year. Now it's payback time. The Gallic riders break through the fortification. Reinforcements are now inevitable. So Caesar creates another barricade, this time around his own men. It's finished just in time. 250,000 Gallic reinforcements turn up. As the weeks pass, the penned-in Gauls in the fort starve. In desperation, Vercingetorix lets 20,000 women and children leave the fort, believing Caesar will let them pass. He doesn't.
Thousands of people, old people, women, children, useless mouths in terms of war, cast out into this no man's land and then denied any escape by Caesar, so they simply die of starvation. As far as Caesar's concerned, he doesn't even count the numbers. They're just collateral damage.
The Gallic fighters watch helplessly as their wives and children slowly perish. Is this the action of a psychopath? Or does it make good strategic sense?
This is certainly a tremendously ruthless act. However, at this point, Caesar has calculated that the ends justify the means.
The siege of Alesia ends with a final pitched battle. Vercingetorix and 60,000 Gauls break out of the fort and storm a weak point in the Roman lines.
Pitched battle has lasted all day, tens of thousands of men, and the Gauls are mentally and physically exhausted. And then Caesar commits the last reserve. He tells us that he leads that last reserve into action in person, wearing a scarlet cloak so he can be recognized. And the Gallic army shatters like a pane of glass, and the battle is over.
Caesar writes that had his men not been so exhausted from battle, not a Gaul would have been left alive. Caesar fights on, but the battle at Alesia is the last real organized resistance by the Gallic armies. Vercingetorix is held captive for 5 years, then taken to Rome. He's paraded through the streets in chains. At the climax of the parade, he's strangled.
No one could deny that Caesar was a military genius. The conquest of Gaul was one of the greatest military campaigns in history, but it came at an enormous cost in human suffering.
It takes Caesar 9 years to subjugate the Gauls, but he wants to make sure that they know they're beaten. 2,000 captured rebel holdouts will carry the message.
Caesar ordered that both hands of every man should be cut off. And these mutilated men were then sent back to their villages to act as a warning. The systematic use here of terror as a way of intimidating people into not fighting back against the Romans.
Caesar makes a fortune conquering Gaul. Finally, free of debt, he pursues his real goal, Rome. But his alliance has broken down. The wealthy Crassus is dead, and the warrior Pompey, now in charge, is having second thoughts about Caesar. His political opponents accuse him of war crimes. If Caesar sets a sandal in Rome, he'll be prosecuted. Worse, the conqueror will soon be feeling a little conquered himself, having blackouts and seizures. Now investigators can finally identify the mysterious illness that would cripple the most powerful man on the planet. '49 BC, the river Rubicon, the border to Italy. On its banks stand Caesar and his army.
The Rubicon has become a byword for passing the point of no return. It's often used about military operations. The Americans talked about crossing the Rubicon when they first went into Iraq.
Caesar is about to make the most important decision of his political life. As governor of Gaul, he can't be prosecuted for riding roughshod over the Senate's laws. As soon as Caesar crosses the Rubicon, he enters Roman territory. He loses immunity, and his enemies can pounce. His only protection is to take his army with him. But that would be a declaration of war.
Caesar knows that if he crosses the river, he breaks one of the fundamental laws of the Roman state. He's launching a military coup. It's the biggest decision of his life. And we get a real insight into his mind when we learn that at that moment, what he says, making the decision in Latin, is, "Let's roll the dice."
Does Caesar really have the mind of a gambler?
Caesar really doesn't believe that this is a 50-50 proposition. He knows that the odds are in his favor, though there is a major risk. Psychologically, crossing the Rubicon means that he's thrown out the rule book completely. It's a whole new ball game. He is in charge.
The 50-year-old Caesar crosses the Rubicon with his army and marches on Rome. His former ally, Pompey, is all that stands between Caesar and absolute power.
Remember that life expectancy in Roman times was much lower than it is today, so a man in his 50s was considered to be very old indeed. Caesar probably thought that he was on borrowed time, and he seems to have made a decision from that point on that he was going to force the pace of events.
He chases Pompey and his armies around southern Europe, and after 4 years of bloody civil war, defeats him. Now Caesar's the absolute leader of the Roman Empire. He's a living legend. But Pompey isn't his only victory on campaign. His sexual conquests include the Queen of Egypt, the fabled Cleopatra. She's just 22, and he's 50, an old man by the standards of the day. And when he meets the wife of another high ranker, the king of the North African state of Mauritania, he beds her as well. Caesar is getting older, and Suetonius and Plutarch report that he isn't quite the man he was.
Julius Caesar becomes increasingly ill. Blackouts, fainting spells, fits. What was the cause of all of this? Was it malaria or was it some other cause?
Clearly, he needs to see a doctor. Neurosurgeon Richard McLachlan thinks Caesar's fits were caused by a worm he caught on conquest in Egypt.
Caesar, about a year before he had his first seizure, had spent a considerable amount of time in North Africa, specifically in Egypt. And we know that cysticercosis, which is basically a condition related to the pig tapeworm, was endemic in Egypt at that time because we've seen evidence of it in Egyptian mummies.
Worms. The effects are horrific.
I would liken it to the script of a bad horror movie. A person has a giant worm inside their belly. That worm produces eggs, which result in small worms, which migrate to the brain, where they produce cysts. They sit in these cysts as a little worm, creating seizures.
Worms, eating away at the brain, causing fits. In Roman times, there's no pill for this. Caesar is for the first time truly helpless. It's devastating.
Psychologically, the effect of Caesar's epilepsy is to show him he's no longer in control. He's no longer invincible. He is, in fact, quite mortal like everyone else.
With time running out, Caesar moves to cement his position, calling himself dictator for life. But even this isn't enough. He wants to be king.
A key moment that takes place right in the heart of Rome is Julius Caesar standing on the rostra. The crowd is in the piazza in front of him. And Mark Antony approaches the rostra, comes over to Julius Caesar, and offers him a crown. People are wondering what's going to happen. Caesar refuses it. There is some cheering. Mark Antony again insists and gives him the crown. Caesar refuses it again. Now the crowd erupts. They're ecstatic. And this seems to be a PR stunt gone wrong, because there's no way that Mark Antony would have been acting on his own. This has to be because Caesar is allowing him to do so. Caesar is testing the waters, and the people do respond. They love Caesar, but they do not want a king.
Caesar won't be a king. He'll just act like one. It's a decision he'll pay for with his life. Caesar's 56 years old. He's made himself dictator for life, but he behaves more like a king. The decrees fly fast and furious. He orders that his statue is placed alongside those of the old kings of Rome, that a new calendar is created, one that includes a month named after himself, July, and that a coin is struck bearing his laurel-wreathed image. This guy is getting too big for his toga.
For us, seeing a ruler on a coin is no big deal. But for an ancient Roman, it was astounding. This is breaking all the rules, because in and throughout Roman history, you never depicted a person living on a coin. Now, Julius Caesar is doing it. So what he's saying is very, very powerful. He's telling the people, I'm not just your leader, I am your ruler. He's very, very close to saying, I am like a king.
The Romans don't like kings, don't trust them, and don't want anything to do with them. It's been that way for 400 years. That's why they're a republic. But Caesar takes no notice. He's out of control.
Caesar is tightening his grip on Rome. He's pushed through a whole series of reforms through until 44 BC. And now there's a growing discontented body of senators. At the head, there's one senator, Cassius, a longtime rival of Caesar, and also Junius Brutus, someone that Caesar considers his friend.
The sexual exploits that got Caesar to the top would come back to haunt him. It's bad enough that he slept with Cassius's wife, but worse, he did the same with Brutus's mother. He figures the universal rule, don't sleep with your friend's mother, doesn't apply to him. Any goodwill Caesar had with the senators is long gone. They decide there's only one solution: assassination. March 15th, 44 BC. The Ides of March. Caesar never sees it coming. 23 dagger blows bring him down. The last face he sees may well have been that of his one-time friend and ally, Brutus, as he utters the words, "This is what happens to tyrants." Caesar, the aristocrat born in the mean streets of Rome, clawed his way out of the slums to become the most powerful leader in the known world. His military campaigns had an appallingly high body count. Almost 20% of the entire population of Gaul, the equivalent of 50 million US citizens today. Where does the behavior of this ancient behaving badly put Caesar on the psychopathic scale of tyrants?
Caesar does not have a bloodlust. He doesn't kill for killing's sake. The violence is directed towards building an empire with himself in the center.
So he's not a kill-for-kicks psychotic, like, for example, Caligula. Caesar's at the other end of the scale, a ruthless, eye-on-the-ball, goal-driven killer. That's one aspect of his personality. There's another to consider.
A second dimension of Caesar's personality is what one would call sexual dominance. Sex is not only for pleasure, but to dominate the world around him.
It's about power and control. On this scale of sexual dominance, Caesar rates very highly. This is the psychological profile of Julius Caesar. So who in history has similar traits?
I think Julius Caesar is most like Genghis Khan. They both came from noble lineage that had fallen on hard times. They both developed a vision of empire with the necessary armies and physical violence to back it up. And along the way, they both bedded every woman they could.
But the assassins had misjudged the mood of the people. The victories on the battlefield brought glory to Rome, and the people loved him for this. They didn't believe him a tyrant. To honor him, they built a funeral pyre and burned his body. Then they turned their wrath on the conspirators who killed their conquering hero. The murderers flee the city to save themselves. Caesar wanted to be king. Now the Senate makes him more than that. Much more. A statue of Caesar is put in the Pantheon, a building dedicated to the gods of Rome. And in death, he's made a god. The first person to receive that honor since Romulus, the founder of Rome, 700 years before.